The world's largest oil reserves, sitting in a country where 30% of the population has already fled, Russian and Iranian weapons flowing in, and in August 2025, for the first time since the 1980s, the US assembled a massive naval strike force just miles from Venezuela's coast, with 8 warships, a nuclear submarine, and over 4,000 Marines. Officially, it was about drugs and refugees, but here's the truth nobody wanted to say out loud, because Washington was actually preparing to invade. And in a stunning turn of events in early 2026, they did exactly that. So today, we're breaking down exactly how this happened and why Nicolas Maduro is now sitting in a Florida prison cell. To understand this crisis, we need to rewind to 1999 when Hugo Chavez stormed into power, promising to defy the United States. And by 2002, the relationship had already collapsed when the CIA even backed a coup that briefly removed Chavez from office, proving US intervention in Venezuela wasn't a conspiracy theory, but reality. And Chavez built his entire image around defying Washington, constantly painting the US as an imperialist enemy, while his successor, Nicolas Maduro, doubled down on that message, turning being anti-American into Venezuela's official brand, which created a spiral of retaliation where Venezuela seized oil fields, the US hit back with rising sanctions, and the 2000s turned into a slow-motion collision course bound to explode. By 2025, Maduro had forced his way into a third term after a blatantly rigged election that saw thousands of opponents thrown in jail, and the world condemned it, but Maduro didn't care, leaving Venezuela completely isolated with no diplomatic ties and no trust on either side. And that's when every supply ship, every military advisor, and every frozen bank account turned into a potential spark for open conflict. Here's the crazy part about Venezuela's oil situation, because on paper, they should be filthy rich, sitting on the largest oil reserves in the world with over 300 billion barrels, which is more than Saudi Arabia. And in the 1990s, they pumped over 3 million barrels a day, with nearly 2 million flowing straight to the US. But today, the oil giant has collapsed to less than 20% of its peak, because Venezuela's oil is so thick, it can't even flow through pipelines without being mixed with lighter fuels, meaning the country with more oil than anyone else has to import fuel from Iran just to move its own crude. And the system is falling apart with over 25 pipelines leaking and breaking, plants running at less than 10% capacity, and state oil company PDVSA dropping from over 40,000 trained engineers in the late 1990s to fewer than 12,000 today, with the real talent having fled to Canada, Colombia, and Texas, taking decades of irreplaceable knowledge with them. The economic collapse is staggering beyond comprehension because just 2 decades ago, Venezuela's GDP sat around $300 billion, but by 2025, it's barely $110 billion, which is a collapse on par with the Great Depression. And inflation at one point hit over 1,000,000%, where people carried stocks of cash that couldn't even buy a loaf of bread. And by 2023, surveys showed that 82% of Venezuelans were worried about running out of food, with almost half the country facing moderate to severe hunger, and the poverty line officially over 50%, but independent estimates put it closer to 70%. And the most shocking figure is that nearly 1 in 3 Venezuelans have fled the country, with the UN counting 7.9 million Venezuelans living abroad, making it the second largest refugee crisis in the world after Syria. As Venezuela's economy collapsed, Maduro reached out for lifelines, but the countries answering his calls weren't friends of Washington, because Russia, China, and Iran all stepped in, seizing the chance to turn Venezuela into a strategic outpost in America's backyard. And in May 2025, Maduro stood in Moscow and signed a sweeping 10-year strategic partnership with Russia, covering energy, financial aid, advanced technology, and most alarmingly, military cooperation, which Venezuela's own foreign minister bragged was the first time in history a Latin American nation had signed a deal of this scale with Russia, making military ties a top priority. And to US analysts, this wasn't just a desperate move by a crumbling regime, but the opening chapter of a proxy war in the Western Hemisphere, which ultimately became one of the key justifications for the invasion that followed. Russia quietly shipped spare parts to keep Venezuela's aging Soviet-era fighter jets flying and began upgrading air defenses with military advisors embedded on the ground.
China reopened crucial oil credit lines and poured money into infrastructure projects designed to lock up Venezuelan resources for decades. And Iran supplied refinery technology, signed nearly $500 million in contracts, and intelligence reports say Iranian drones, anti-ship missiles, and small naval vessels have already made their way into Venezuela's arsenal. So add thousands of Cuban security advisors still embedded in the government, plus Colombian guerrilla groups and narco cartels operating freely across the border, and the result is Venezuela becoming a forward operating base for America's enemies right in the US's own hemisphere.
When Trump returned to the White House in January 2025, Washington wasted no time tightening the screws with oil waivers scrapped and Chevron's license gone, cutting off Venezuela's last reliable revenue streams overnight. But the real shock came on July 25, 2025, when for the first time in American history, the U.S. Treasury labeled an entire foreign military leadership, Venezuela's so-called Cartel de los Soles, as a global terrorist organization with every asset frozen and every bank transfer criminalized, because no military in the world had ever been hit with that label before. And at the same time, Trump doubled the bounty on Nicolas Maduro's head to an outrageous $50 million while quietly ordering the Pentagon to prepare military options. By late August 2025, those options suddenly looked real when a U.S. naval strike group with 7 warships and a nuclear submarine moved into the southern Caribbean, making it the largest American show of force in the region since the 1980s. And the lineup was no token patrol, with 3 Aegis destroyers, a guided missile cruiser, and the amphibious assault ship USS Iwo Jima carrying 4,500 troops, including 2,200 Marines with helicopters and amphibious vehicles, which is enough firepower to seize beaches, neutralize air defenses, and topple a government in days. And on paper, Washington still insisted this was about drugs and refugees, but the buildup sent a louder message because this looked less like policing cartels and more like preparing for war, and everyone's worst fears were confirmed when the operation finally launched. Caracas knew what was coming because satellite images showed frantic preparations with new defense corridors carved around oil facilities, coastal radar systems reinforced, and dozens of small gunboats patrolling the shoreline. And President Maduro personally toured border states, deploying 15,000 troops to Colombia's frontier while delivering his most defiant warning, claiming the U.S. had positioned 8 warships, a submarine, and over 4,200 missiles within striking distance. And Maduro vowed that if American forces crossed the line, Venezuela would unleash a republic in arms, mobilizing not just the army but millions of civilians for guerrilla warfare. But those threats proved hollow when the actual invasion came. In the early morning hours of January 2026, the United States launched Operation Liberación, a swift and coordinated military strike that caught the Venezuelan military completely off guard despite months of warnings. And within 72 hours, American forces had secured Caracas, neutralized Venezuela's air defenses, and captured key oil infrastructure across the country with minimal resistance from a demoralized and underpaid Venezuelan military that had been hollowed out by years of corruption and sanctions. And the amphibious assault began with pre-dawn airstrikes from carrier-based fighter jets that systematically destroyed Venezuela's Soviet-era radar systems and anti-aircraft batteries. The operation was swift and brutal, with overwhelming American firepower facing scattered and disorganized resistance. And within hours, the Venezuelan military's command structure had completely collapsed. And Maduro's promised republic in arms never materialized because the civilian militias he had spent years training simply melted away when faced with the reality of American after the invasion began. Nicolas Maduro was captured by U.S. Special Forces in a safe house on the outskirts of Caracas. An American military helicopter was broadcast around the world within hours, sending shockwaves through every anti-American government on the planet. And Maduro was immediately flown to a U.S. military base and then transported to face federal charges. And the invasion that once seemed unthinkable had become reality, proving that when economic warfare fails to achieve regime change, Washington
Washington is willing to finish the job with military force, and Nicolas Maduro, who spent years defying the United States and building himself up as a revolutionary hero, is now sitting in a prison cell awaiting trial. And the question is no longer whether America would invade Venezuela, but rather what comes next now that they actually did, and Maduro is behind bars facing life in prison. Because this invasion represents the most significant U.S. military action in Latin America in decades, and proves that America's willingness to use force in its own hemisphere is stronger than ever when strategic interests like oil, refugee flows, and geopolitical competition with Russia and China are at stake.
If you want to stay informed on stories like this, please like, comment, and subscribe so you don't miss future updates.